There's a thread on a Pennsylvania fishing forum claiming you can get fined $400 for spreading a $2 powder in your own farm pond. I read the thread last week. Then I read Title 58 of the Pennsylvania Code, Chapter 7.3. The thread is wrong about 3 things, and it's right about 1. I want to walk through both with you tonight because if you're like me, you've heard about this powder. The Lancaster County old-timers called it pond meal. The feed store still sells it. 14 states have rules on the books that touch it. None of those rules say what the forum thread says they say. And the difference matters if you've got a half acre of water out behind your barn and you want to put a few bluegill on the table this fall. I'm Amish Zook. Outside Strasbourg, 4 generations of small pond keeping and 40 years of watching the tackle industry sell people $14 attractant sprays that do less than what my grandfather mixed in a coffee tin for 2 cents in 1962. Tonight we're talking about the powder. We're talking about what it is. We're talking about the actual rule in 14 states. And we're talking about where the line sits, because there is a line. And I want you to know which side of it you're on before you scatter a handful in your back pond. Here's the powder. 2 parts dry anise seed, ground in a hand grinder until it's the texture of cornmeal. 2 parts roasted garlic powder from the bulk goods aisle at the Amish dry goods store on Old Philadelphia Pike. 3 parts plain yellow cornmeal. You mix it dry in a mason jar. You shake it. You sniff it once. If your eyes water, you got the proportions right. Total cost for a quart jar at the feed store and the bulk goods store this week here in Lancaster County ran me $1.94. The pond meal recipe goes back at least to the 1920s in this county. I learned it from Levi Esch outside intercourse in the spring of 1981. He had a quart jar of it sitting on the shelf above his bait freezer, and the jar had a date written on masking tape that said October 73. Levi was 64 when he showed me, which means he learned the recipe from a man born around the turn of the century. Now here's where the forum thread starts going wrong. The thread claims this powder is federally banned. It isn't. There is no federal ban on anise, garlic, or cornmeal as a fish attractant. None. You can search the Code of Federal Regulations, Title 50, Part 16, which is the Lacey Act Injurious Wildlife List, and you will not find anise. You will not find garlic. You will not find cornmeal. The federal level is silent. The thread was wrong on that point, and the man writing it had not done his homework. What the thread was reaching for and got tangled up about is something different. It's a body of state regulations that govern an activity called chumming. Chumming, in plain English, is the practice of putting food or scent or attractant material into the water for the purpose of drawing fish toward where you want to fish. Some states regulate chumming heavily. Some states don't regulate it at all. And the 14 states people keep referencing, those aren't states that banned the powder. They're states that put limits on the broader practice of chumming, and the powder gets caught up in the language depending on how a warden interprets the statute on a Tuesday afternoon. Here's what the rule actually says in Pennsylvania. Title 58, Chapter 73, the regulations of the Pennsylvania Fish and Boat Commission, addresses chumming in Section 73.3. Chumming is permitted in Pennsylvania waters for most species. There are exceptions. You cannot chum for trout in approved trout waters during the regular season. You cannot chum within 100 yards of a dam on a commission-managed lake. And on your own private pond, water that does not connect to a navigable waterway, no permit is required. None. You can mix pond meal in a mason jar and spread it on your own quarter-acre pond on a Saturday morning, and you have broken no Pennsylvania law. That is the truth of the rule. Real citation. You can look it up. Title 58, Chapter 73, Section 73.3. Now, I'm not a lawyer. Verify with your state DNR before you act, especially if your pond drains into a creek or if you've got a stream running through your property that feeds into the Conestoga or the Susquehanna. Once the water connects, the rule changes. We'll get to that in a minute. Let me walk you through the kinds of states where you do need to pay attention. There are roughly 4 buckets a state can fall into on this question, and once you understand the 4 buckets, you can place your own state without me having to name all 50. Bucket 1 is lake-specific restriction. These are states where chumming, including the use of dry attractant powders, is restricted on specific bodies of water, but permitted elsewhere. Michigan is one of these. Michigan's Department of Natural Resources prohibits chumming on certain inland trout lakes and on designated cold water trout streams, but warm water bass and bluegill ponds on private property, no restriction. Wisconsin operates similarly. Vermont, similar. Maine, similar. If you live in a state with a strong trout fishery tradition, this bucket is probably you. Bucket 2 is species-specific restriction. These are states where you cannot chum for certain species, regardless of where you are. Tennessee restricts chumming for trout statewide. Virginia restricts chumming for striped bass on certain reservoirs. North Carolina has rules around chumming for catfish in tournament waters. The pond meal recipe is not species banned, but if you're using it to draw channel cats in Tennessee waters where chumming for trout happens to be regulated, a warden could ask questions, and the conversation gets easier if you can show him a mason jar of cornmeal and anise versus a bucket of cutbait. Bucket 3 is license tier restriction. A small handful of states tie chumming to a particular kind of license. Louisiana is the clearest example. You can chum freely with a recreational fishing license in most parishes, but commercial operations have separate rules. Florida does something similar for saltwater chumming. For our purposes, on freshwater private pond water, license tier almost never applies. Bucket 4 is the strictest tier. Outright restriction on chumming in public waters across the state with private pond exemptions that you have to verify. California is the strictest. California Fish and Game Code Section 7360 addresses material introduction into public waters. Oregon is close behind. New York, restrictive on many specific lakes. If you live in California, Oregon, or New York, read your state code before you scatter anything. On your own private pond, completely landlocked, not draining to a public waterway, you will almost certainly be fine in all 3 of those states. But the burden is on you to verify, not on the warden to forgive. That's the 14-state count, roughly. About 6 states in Bucket 1, about 4 in Bucket 2, about 1 to 2 in Bucket 3, about 3 in Bucket 4. The exact list shifts every few years as state codes get revised, which is the other reason I won't read you a fixed list of 14 names. The list I read you today would be partly wrong in 3 years. The 4-bucket framework, that holds. Let me give you a couple more concrete examples so the buckets feel real. Ohio. Ohio is permissive. Ohio Administrative Code Rule 1501:31-1, one addresses bait and chum. Private pond, no permit, no restriction. Indiana, same. Indiana Administrative Code Title 312, Article 9, similar permissive structure on private water. If you live in Ohio or Indiana, you almost certainly do not need to worry about the powder at all. Kentucky, permissive on private water, lightly restricted on certain public lakes. Tennessee, as I mentioned, restricts chumming for trout, but warm water bass and bluegill on private pond, permissive. Missouri, permissive. Arkansas, permissive. Texas, permissive on private water. The pattern, if you're picking up on it, is that the inland farm pond states, the states where small private ponds are common on rural property, almost all have permissive regulations on private water. The restrictive states tend to be the ones with strong public fishery management traditions, where the agency views the public waters as a managed resource that needs protection from amateur chumming. That distinction, public managed water versus private landlocked water, is the key dividing line in almost every state code I've read. One thing worth saying, the rules can change. 2023 was a big year because of the Sackett decision. 2015 was a big year because of the WOTUS rule expansion. 2001 was a big year in Pennsylvania specifically because the Fish and Boat Commission rewrote Chapter 73. The state code in your state was probably revised in the last 15 years. Don't rely on a forum thread from 2012. Look up the current code. Most states post the regulations free online. The PA Fish and Boat Commission has theirs at fishandboat.com. Your state will have an equivalent. The reading takes about 20 minutes. The reading is worth more than any video I can make. Now let me give you the honesty beat. Here's what I had wrong for a long time. For about 11 years between roughly 1994 and 2005, I thought the pond meal recipe worked equally well in every pond and every season. It does not. The honest answer is, this powder works on catfish, bluegill, sucker, and carp. It works on base only when the water is above 68 degrees and only as a pre-bait, meaning you scatter it the night before and you fish the spot the next morning. It does not work on trout. Trout don't have the olfactory geometry for it. It does not work in cold water, below about 54 degrees, because the volatile compounds in the anise don't diffuse. And it does not work if you scatter it heavy. The first 3 times I tried this, after Levi showed me, I scattered too much. I put a ½ pound in a quarter-acre pond. I caught nothing for 4 days. The pond had so much attractant in the water column that the fish couldn't localize the bait when I dropped it. You scatter sparingly. A handful, maybe 2 ounces, broadcast over a 20-foot diameter circle, once a day for 3 days before you fish. Then you fish over the chum spot with a piece of corn or a worm or a small piece of catfish skin, and the fish come. They come because the water column has been telling them for 3 days that this spot has food. Penn State Extension published a bulletin on attractant compounds in 1968, AERS-43, the Pennsylvania Agricultural Extension Series, page 22 through page 27. The bulletin documented the diffusion physics of plant-based attractants in warm water aquaculture, and it specifically discussed anise, garlic, and cornmeal as the 3 most documented compounds in folk practice. The bulletin sat in the Penn State University Park Agricultural Extension Library for 34 years before it was quietly dropped from the reprint list in the early 2000s. It still exists. You can request it. The librarians there are kind. The methods in that bulletin are real. The powder I'm describing tonight is the powder that bulletin describes. Now here's where the federal regulation conversation gets interesting, because this is where the forum thread was reaching for something real. The Lacey Act of 1900, amended several times since, including significant amendments in 1981, prohibits the interstate transport of certain wildlife and certain plant materials. The Lacey Act does not touch anise or garlic or cornmeal. But the Lacey Act does touch what's called injurious species. If you were to use this powder as a vehicle to introduce a non-native bait fish into a public waterway, the powder itself stays legal, but the act of introducing the bait fish becomes a federal issue. That is what got tangled up in the forum thread. Somebody read about a Lacey Act enforcement, conflated it with the powder, and started a rumor. The Clean Water Act of 1972 is also worth knowing about, because this is the parent rule for anything you do with water on your property. Section 404 of the Clean Water Act governs discharge of dredged or fill material into waters of the United States. The Supreme Court narrowed the scope of waters of the United States in 2023 in Sackett v. EPA. After Sackett, a pond on your own property that does not have a continuous surface connection to a navigable waterway is no longer covered by the Clean Water Act in the way most forum threads assume. Most fishing forums have not caught up to Sackett. They are still operating under the 2015 WOTUS rule. If your pond is landlocked, fed by rain or by a well, and does not surface drain to a creek that surface drains to a river, you are almost certainly outside the federal jurisdiction entirely. The Sackett decision changed this. Most fishing channels have not caught up yet, Let me say it plainly. On your own private pond, in most states, water that does not connect to a navigable waterway, you can mix pond meal and scatter it and fish over it without any permit and without any reg violation. That is the most honest answer I can give you. Verify your state. Don't take my word for any of this. Title 58, Chapter 73 is the Pennsylvania citation. Your state will have an equivalent in its fish and game code. Find the chumming section. Read the exceptions. If you don't fall in an exception, you're clear. Here's how I use the powder in practice. I keep a quart mason jar of it on the shelf above my bait freezer, same as Levi Ash did in '81. Day 1, I walk out to the back pond in the evening, around 7, and I scatter a small handful, maybe 2 ounces, over a 20-foot circle near a point of bank where there's a little structure underneath, a sunken log or a drop-off. Day 2, same thing, same spot, same time. Day 3, same. Day 4, I show up at first light with a rod and a piece of corn on a number 6 hook. I sit on the bank. I drop the corn into the chummed spot. Within 20 minutes, usually less, the bluegills start. The catfish come later in the morning, if the water is warm enough. The whole operation cost me about 30 cents in powder over 4 days, and the fish that go on the table cost me less than the gasoline to drive to a state park to fish public water with a license stamp and a parking fee. If you do need to file a permit for some other reason, say you're building a new pond and you're not sure if your soil drains to a creek somewhere, the process is straightforward in most states. You contact your county conservation district. They send a soil scientist out to look. The visit is usually free. They give you a written opinion. The opinion either says you're outside the jurisdiction, in which case you do nothing more, or they tell you which permit you'd need if you wanted to expand the pond. The permit, if needed, runs between $50 and $400 depending on the state. The timeline is 6 to 12 weeks. The conservation district people, in my experience, are generally helpful and not adversarial. They want pond owners to do things correctly. They do not want to write tickets. That is not their job. A few more notes on the powder itself. Store it dry. Moisture is the enemy. A quart mason jar with a tight lid on a shelf at room temperature will hold for about 18 months before the anise starts to lose volatility. If you live somewhere humid, store it in the spring house or the basement, not in the garage. Don't make a big batch. A quart jar will run you a season on a quarter-acre pond. Don't substitute fresh garlic for the powder. The water content in fresh garlic rots in the mix within a week and turns the whole jar sour. Don't add fish oil. Fish oil is its own attractant and it works fine. But the moment you add it to the dry powder, you've changed the regulatory conversation in some states from a plant-based chum to an animal-based chum, and a few states have stricter rules on animal-based chum. Keep it plant-based. Keep it simple. 2 cents of materials. The recipe my grandfather used in '54. The recipe Levi Ash kept in a labeled jar in his pole barn outside intercourse. The recipe that works because the diffusion physics has not changed in 100 years. One last thing before I let you go. Tell me your state in the comments. Tell me your county if you're willing. I read every comment that comes in on this channel. If there's a state I haven't covered in detail yet, and you're in a state where chumming gets complicated, I'll address it in the next video specifically. I'm building a small library of state-by-state notes as the channel grows, and the comments are how I know where to focus. Bucket 1, 2, 3, or 4, post which one you think your state falls into, and I'll tell you if I agree. I'm not a lawyer. I'm not a fisheries officer. I'm a man who has kept ponds in Lancaster County for 40 years and read more state codes than I ever wanted to. Verify before you act. Read the actual rule in your actual state. The forum threads are mostly wrong. The state codes are mostly clear if you read them. Subscribe so you don't miss the next one. There's a related video coming on the 3 garden materials the tackle industry stopped selling after 1997. I want to walk through those next. That's what I've got for you tonight. Tight lines, deep water, and stay curious.